such a pleasure to welcome you all here. It really is. The League of Women Voters is going to be celebrating its centennial in February. It survives because it has developed in a non-partisan manner credibility. It encourages people to learn about the major issues of our society and then act upon them. Certainly, one of these major issues is criminal justice reform. Ferguson was a turning point for many of us at the League of Women Voters of Los Angeles. The shooting of unarmed men and women of color by agencies of our government called into question whether we can trust our democracy to function equitably. The League only acts after intensive study, and our committee's immediate focus was on police-community relations. It took us a while to identify a critical player hidden behind closed doors. It was the district attorney who, especially in the lock-em-up era, affected sentencing. The results? Our nation has the highest rate of incarceration in the entire world. Tonight is designed, as Carolina said, to illuminate this often hidden role and to encourage your focus on the upcoming election. But before we go any further, I want to introduce our extraordinary partner, the coalition. Jess Farris from the ACLU of Southern California will tell you who they are.
You are about to hear why district attorneys are so powerful, why you should care about district attorneys, why you should help your friends and family care about district attorneys. You're going to hear from each panelist about what district attorneys do impact our lives as Los Angelinos every day. If you like this, and I think you will, then you will love our coalition. It's the LA Coalition for DA Justice and Accountability. There's a small sheet that was outside on the table where you can sign up to be involved in the coalition in different ways. If you did not sign up when you were coming in and you are so inspired to do so going out, there are a lot left, and we have pens, and I would be happy to talk to you more about what we're doing. But this is an excellent time to plug in. And beyond that, every single person here is welcome and will have a good place to make a contribution. So we're hoping to collect a lot of these cards. I'll be in the back, and if anyone wants to talk to me more deeply, I'm available. And thank you.
We're thrilled to have as our moderator tonight someone you will recognize from CBS 2 and KCAL 9 News. Please give a warm welcome to Dave Bryan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a little rusty. I retired a few months ago, so take me a couple minutes to get up to speed here. I hope you'll be okay with that. First thing I want to do is to thank all of you for being here tonight. I got word, and you may not know about this, that there is another debate going on tonight. And I'm thinking, well, we'll have 2 or 3 people here, and it'll be fun. But it's great that you all are here, and I really appreciate your presence, especially considering what the other debate was about. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. I think that's important, and then we'll talk a little bit about leading in, and then we'll get right into the action here. So on your right here is Ellie Virrueta. She's with the Youth Justice Coalition, and right next to her is Michael Saavedra. He's also with the Youth Justice Coalition, and thanks both of you for being here tonight. And then what we have on the other side is we have Jody Armour, the gentleman in the middle here. Jody is professor of law at the University of Southern California. He specializes in race issues and legal decision making. Miriam Kwinsky, Miriam, is the Associate Director of the Criminal Justice Program at UCLA School of Law. I'm sorry, I read that's not, okay, see, I told you, I'm a little mixed up here. Yeah. So Miriam is actually, just wanted to see if you were paying attention. Miriam is actually the Executive Director of Fair and Just Prosecution. And Alicia Virani is the Associate Director of the Criminal Justice Program at UCLA School of Law. So thanks to all of you for being here. So, going back many, many years, the rallying cry for criminal justice was lock them up and throw away the key. It was, it was 3 strikes and you're out. And it was, let's just build more prisons, because that's really working. And the truth is, a lot of supporters say, well, maybe it did work, because crime rates are down generally across the country. Maybe it did what it was supposed to do. But critics say, at what price? The human price and the financial price of putting so much resources into prisons, and they say, getting very little back. And we're not here to take sides today or to take positions, but just to explain what the criminal justice reform movement is all about. And that's very important, because this is now a movement that is starting to really take hold here in California and across the country. The district attorneys in California have tremendous power and authority. And they're the ones who will, in the end, either make changes or not. And so I'm not singling out any district attorney in particular, because they all have this kind of authority. I want to get started right away here. Everybody's going to have a chance to talk about what they're doing in this movement and what it means. And Ellie, why don't we start with you?
Hello everybody, my name is Ellie. Oh, it's Ellie said, but I do go by Ellie. I'm an organizer, a youth organizer with the Youth Justice Coalition, and I'm also the Stop Coalition coordinator. The Stop Coalition is a coalition of a statewide coalition of families who had loved ones killed by law enforcement, and it stands for Stop Terrorism and Oppression by Police. And the reason that I got involved in social justice was stems from myself being undocumented. I am a DACA recipient, and I had my dad be deported 3 times throughout my childhood. So that's kind of where the origins of social justice stem from. And I wanted to get even more involved once in 2012 when I had my cousin who was 14 years old, who was shot and killed by law enforcement in Santa Ana. And because he was only 14 years old, so those 2 main things were what kind of propelled me into the social justice realm and into organizing. And for those of you that don't know what YJC is, we're the Youth Justice Coalition. We're a coalition, but also an organization, a system-impacted youth-led organization based out of South Central. And we do have the organizing component, and we also have a high school for students that were pushed out of traditional high school. And I think for me, the single most important issue that needs to be addressed is ensuring that we have abolitionist framework in all the work that we do. I think that reform to me is only okay if it's on the road toward abolition.
And Michael, you're next. You're also with the Youth Justice Coalition. So how did you get into this?
For me, it started, I spent 15 and a half years in solitary confinement in the prison system. And I saw a really oppressive and racist system even within the prison system itself. A lot of people aren't aware up until more recently after the hunger strikes, and there was a lot of protests around keeping people in solitary confinement for lengthy periods of time, which folks should consider as cruel and unusual punishment. So for me as a young person going inside and being kept in there for that long, I started to see how it was predominantly black and brown people. And it's very easy for the Department of Corrections to put this label, this gang label on you in order to justify keeping you in solitary confinement. So in 2012, people who had already been in solitary for over a decade, some folks for 20, 30 years decided, we have to come together in solidarity, and how can we end this practice? So around 2012, we all came together and we agreed to end all hostilities amongst prisoners and factions and gangs within the prison system, to stop killing each other and fighting amongst each other, and to come together in solidarity and come up with a way to try to resist or fight against this oppressive system. And so we came to the point of having a hunger strike, and that's what actually led me to see how organizing and coming together in solidarity can fight against these oppressive systems.
And briefly, what to you is the single most important issue here, just quickly?
I think the single most important issue, or the most oppressive issue, which is very racist and criminalizing, is the use of gang enhancements for folks. Because typically somebody can get pulled over or get a very low-level crime and they add an additional 10 years to their sentence just because they say it was for the benefit or because they're a part of a so-called gang.
I have had a family member impacted by the criminal legal system, but prior to that, after I graduated from college, had many experiences that exposed me to the injustices of this system. And I think even when you get one tiny window into how unfair and racist and oppressive this system is, how could you not care and how could you not dedicate your life to fighting against this system? And so that's sort of where I came from and why I decided to go to law school and become a public defender. And when I was a public defender in Orange County, every single day you are just seeing people being railroaded in court, being given options that are not options, choices being made for their lives that could change and ruin the rest of their lives. And it's truly just a monster of a system that really has brought so many people under the surveillance and incarceration of this criminal legal system. So I guess for me, it's how could I not be involved in fighting the system? It's so hard to think of the single most important issue, but what came to mind is truly just the adversarial nature of the system. So as a public defender, prior to that, I had been doing work in restorative and transformative justice, which I can talk more about later because I only have 30 seconds now. But really seeing that when an offense happens, when harm happens, that it impacts so many people, and the system right now doesn't bring all of those people who need healing, who need access to justice, doesn't bring all of those people together. And so the adversarial nature, the pitting of people who have caused harm and victims and survivors of harm against each other, when oftentimes they're from the same communities, is truly one of the biggest issues.
Jody?
Hi, I'm Jody Armour. I teach at the University of Southern California Law School of Law for about 22 years now. It's good for me to see my brother in the audience sitting next to my wife, Frida. My brother has shared the experience that got me involved and interested in this set of issues. We were all introduced to the majesty of the law when I was 8 years of age, and police kicked in our door, shackled my dad, put him in a jumpsuit, and gave 22 to 55 years for first-time possession and sale of marijuana. We talk about family separation. Family separation doesn't just happen at the border. It's been happening as part of our criminal justice process for umpteen years. We went from middle-class existence to crumbs and roaches and rats, just like that. When the breadwinner was sentenced to 22 and 55 years, it has collateral effects like sending my mom into deep depression and suicidal efforts and attempts, and he was fortunately able to teach himself the law in prison through the warden's own law books, write his own writs of habeas corpus, represent himself pro se up through the state system and the federal system, until when I was 14, I'm standing with him in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals while he's literally arguing in front of an en banc panel of judges for his life. And now I teach his case in my criminal law course called Armour versus Saavedra, which stands for the proposition that a prosecutor cannot lie to a jury to get it violates a due process right of a defendant for the prosecutor to lie to the jury in order to secure a conviction against a defendant. So the DA's mentality too often is just win baby at any and all costs. And that is one of the things we're going to have to turn around. But I'm going to hand it over now to one of my idols, Miriam Krinsky, who's been doing this work in a deep way for a long time.
So, first of all, thank you all for being here. Clearly, this is the group that knows who they're voting for in the primary, because you weren't listening to the debate. But, so I came to this work based on a decade and a half as a prosecutor. I prosecuted here in Los Angeles as well as on the East Coast as a federal prosecutor in the 80s and 90s. And what I saw was not what I had believed I was signing up for when I decided to go into what I believed was public service. I saw too many generations coming into a justice system that was giving up on people, that was becoming a downward spiral where it became about how do prosecutors, how do elected officials outbid each other in that kind of rallying cry that you referred to earlier, where we simply weren't making communities any safer. We were throwing lives away. We were fracturing families, as Jody described, as others have described. And we were doing it at high cost, both in terms of personal lives and in terms of fiscal cost. And we were doing it in a way that was based on this illusory promise that somehow communities were being made healthier or safer. And when I left that, it was to spend a period of time advocating on behalf of children to try to change the system and seize windows of opportunity in young lives. So with all of that as a starting point, I guess what I see as most broken and most in need of change is the failure for those in the justice system to be proximate to families and people whose lives are being affected. Because when you can label people away, when you can turn them into a sterile piece of paper and file, you start to get disconnected from the human cost of what we're doing with our justice system. And I think that's what we most need to change. We need to move away from this illusory assumption that somehow we're safer and we can incarcerate our way out of all of society's problems.
Okay, thank you all very much for that. Alicia, I want to start with you today with the first question, and that is, it's sort of widely described as the district attorney in each county, sort of the most important position in terms of our justice system. Do you think that's true? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, so I want to take us into a journey into the courtrooms here in LA County. So I forgot to introduce my program, which I always do, but I work for the criminal justice program at UCLA School of Law, and as part of that I get to teach a class where I help teach aspiring public defenders to represent individuals in felony bail hearings. And so we do this in LA Superior Courts throughout the county, and we've represented 14 clients so far in our clinic. And every single time we go in, we argue for our client to be released without money bail because we know what happens when people are in jail before their trial. They can be subject to violence, they can lose their jobs, they can lose their housing, they could lose their children potentially. And we know that case outcomes are way, way better for people who are fighting for their case on the outside. So my students go in and they ask judges to release our clients on their own recognizance, right, without money bail. And every single time the district attorneys object. Doesn't matter what the facts of the case are, it doesn't matter how strong we argue, it doesn't matter whether or not we found a mental health program that this person needs or a substance abuse treatment program that this person needs. They object and they argue that $50,000 bail, $110,000 bail is reasonable for our clients to pay. All of these clients are represented by public defenders because they are considered to not have the ability to hire their own attorney. And what this tells me is that the district attorneys, the line district attorneys in every court are not giving individualized consideration to people's cases. They are not taking each person's case and looking at it and saying, what should I do with this individual as different from another? And it also tells me that convictions are their bottom line, that they know that if they hold somebody in custody prior to trial, they are far more likely to plead guilty, because if they give them an offer that says, you can go home today if you plead guilty, how many of us wouldn't take that offer, guilty or not guilty? And so this is the sort of power that they're exercising in the courtroom every day by simply determining to recommend to the judge that this person not be released, or by determining that someone should be held in by an excessive amount of bail. So they do hold that incredible power to both decide what someone should be charged with, which determines how much bail, which then determines what they could potentially be punished with. And this happens with young people in the system as well, right? So if a district attorney decides to charge someone who's between the ages of 16 to 18 with a felony strike offense, they could try to charge that young person as an adult. And that all rests on their decision of what they're going to charge that person with. And there's nothing that says that you have to choose the most serious charge out there. You can choose a lesser charge. A district attorney's job, according to the American Bar Association, is to seek justice, not merely to convict. And yet what we're seeing every day in the courtrooms is their desire to seek convictions, to give plea bargains that are holding things over people's heads, to force them to plead guilty so that they can have more and more convictions.
I'm sorry, and Miriam, I know you wanted to speak on that also.
So I think Alicia recounted the power of DAs incredibly well. And DAs are really the gatekeepers of the justice system. They're the ones who are going to decide whether the door's open, whether the justice system decides to engage, whether we are going to criminalize individuals who are suffering from substance use disorder or mental illness or poverty, or whether we're going to deflect them from the system. And they then decide every critical decision that comes when they engage. Do we charge a mandatory minimum? Do we take that young person and ignore what brain science tells us and hold them responsible as an adult? Do we file a death penalty in a practice that very few Western countries in the world continue to do, unlike many parts of the United States? They're the ones who are going to decide what the end result will be in the case, because 95% of cases are resolved not by a judge and not by a jury, but by the plea bargain that the DA negotiates with the defendant. And so they really have the opportunity to set the dot for the individual's case and for what kind of life they have ahead of them. They're also the ones who, in many instances, can either be the spark for reform or the death knell for reform. When DAs and DA associations stand in the way of criminal justice reform, it's very difficult for those reforms to reach the finish line. That's changing, but certainly in past decades, we've seen that bills and changes that DAs oppose are just not going to come about. So what we've seen is that in too many instances, our communities are simply not paying attention to these individuals who hold this incredible amount of power. We know that 85% of DAs who are incumbents will never get challenged at the time of election. We know that the vast majority of those who are challenged are going to succeed and essentially have life tenure in their job. So I think it's really a challenge to all of us to pay attention to these incredibly important positions. And we are now starting to see a new generation of DAs assume office, run for office, bring a different vision, try to embed within that vision what communities are now more and more asking for, which is a justice system that is not a sort of knee-jerk punitive response to everything that they see around them, that doesn't believe that we should pile on as a sign of success. And I think more and more communities are making different choices. And so Fair and Just Prosecution is working with now over 36 elected DAs around the country who have come into office on a different agenda and with a different vision for the justice system.
Let me, when you ask who's the most important person in our criminal justice system, certainly John Taft's work at Fordham Law School, where he showed that DAs went from charging 1 out of 3 people with felonies roughly to 2 out of 3 felonies in the 80s, 90s, and beyond. That, you just do the math on that and you have the explosion in the prison population. So we focus a lot on that, as we should, but what we may not focus as much on is the people who put the DAs in office, who the voters, the electors, who decide what DAs with what agendas are going to sit in those offices. And that electorate has changed over time. I'm thinking of Chris Rock, who launched his comedic career with an infamous routine that reflected people's attitudes toward criminals in the 80s, where he went back and forth in front of on the stage with a mostly black audience, almost all black audience, and said, I love black people. I'm getting ready to use some harsh language now. I love black people, but I hate niggas. Right? Niggers have got to go. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. I got to do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. That was his routine. He went for 45 minutes in that vein, and his core definition of an N-word was a black person who's done a crime. So, and the people were laughing and rolling in the aisle. What he was saying is that some of these neighborhoods around here, up to 90% of the young black males are going to wind up in jail on probation, on parole at some point in their lives. He was saying up to 90% of our own youth are N-words. That's how we thought about them, and so we put DAs in office who reflected those attitudes. There's been a shift in the Overton window in the last 5 to 10 years. California voters have voted things like Proposition 47, knocking all of these felonies down to misdemeanors, for example, right? And so, out Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, he got 75% of the people of Philadelphia, the electorate, to vote for somebody who never prosecuted a case in his life. He ran on the following platform: end cash bail, address police misconduct, and end mass incarceration. He got 75% of the people of Philadelphia to vote for that platform. The electorate is as important as the DA because the electorate is going to put the progressive DAs in their place.
Thank you. You know, Michael, I want to ask you, because you talked about why you got involved in this and what happened to you, and I wanted to ask you, how does someone's membership in a gang or having friends in a gang, how is this, it sort of corrupt the process in your opinion?
I think first of all, we have to understand that it's law enforcement that put the label gang, right? We're communities of color. We grew up in neighborhoods. We're not intended as gangs. We're just communities that come together. So, I'm sorry, what was your question?
Well,
I got it thrown out.
I was asking about how someone who's supposed to be either in a gang or has friends in a gang, how does that affect the decision to prosecute?
I mean, it's highly effective because once they can put that label on you, they can demonize you and now say, okay, you're part of this criminal organization or this part of society that is looked frowned upon and being the worst of the worst. Therefore, we have to eliminate you, and it's all part of a racist system that focuses and zeroes in on people of color and communities of color. So I think that's the justification, and that's the way that the criminal justice system is able to separate people from, like, your Prop 47 people. Because once it's a criminal gang involved or a gang type case, now they can add on so much time and criminalize you, and the jurors are automatically prejudiced when they hear that. You know, just like folks out here, just like when Trump says, oh, MS-13, they're killers, they're evil people, using that to justify, you know, creating more border patrol and locking people up in these encampments. So I think it's really a way just to put a label on somebody and justify sending them to prison or treating them in a way that you wouldn't treat ordinary people that are not labeled like that.
Yeah. Ellie, I want to ask you about some of the terminology that's being used now in this movement. And what is the transformative justice, sometimes called restorative justice, and when is it appropriate to implement such a program?
Well, they are two different things, restorative justice and transformative justice. But I think the word that's more common, it has been co-opted a lot, is restorative justice. And to me, restorative justice, different folks have different interpretations of it, but to me, restorative justice implies that there was peace, or that there was something that, we're working collectively to restore. But at YJC, we use transformative justice, which is kind of like a step, one more step where we transform collectively an issue, or hold somebody accountable, repair harm that has been done, without necessarily relying on law enforcement or on the punitive criminal justice system. So for an example, like at the school, when students get into a fight, or they get into an argument or whatever, we have our campus, our community center is a cop-free zone. We don't kick the students out, we don't call the cops on them. We have circles where we try to repair the harm with the person that caused the harm and the person that was harmed and other folks to repair the issue. And we're working on a larger community alternatives to 911. If y'all are interested, it's tomorrow. We're going to be talking about mental health, but it's how can we collectively push away from the criminal justice system and having to rely on law enforcement when there's like a domestic dispute, when there's somebody that is, has taken drugs or is, drunk or whatever. So the community, especially in communities of color, we know how to support one another, and some of us don't want to, have to call the cops, because that ends up, escalating the situation. With my cousin, that's exactly what happened. He was going through a mental health crisis, and law enforcement were called, and a 14-year-old ended up getting killed. And that has happened time and time again. So, I don't know if that necessarily answers your question.
No, I think so. Thank you. I appreciate it. Miriam, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned about this rush for prosecution on the part of many district attorneys. I wanted to ask you, what, in your opinion, should the district attorneys do to measure success, and also to share that information more transparently? What's going to change that?
Well, I think our system is going to keep moving in the direction it's moved with only incremental change, unless and until we start to break down some of these labels and start to embrace a different meaning for what we want and what we need from our justice system. And as long as we categorize individuals as gang members, as violent individuals, we're not looking at what it is that caused the behavior in the first instance. And so I think first and foremost, and it's one of the things that John Pfaff has talked about, who Jody mentioned, we have to realize that if we want to think big, we can't simply nibble at the edges. We can't simply say, let's change our justice system by looking at non-violent first-time offenders. We really have to own the fact that there are individuals serving time today, serving decades on end, who have been there for decades on end, who don't need to be there anymore. And we need to have district attorneys who are willing, in part, to measure success by not simply how they're dispensing justice moving forward, but how they're looking backward at the individuals who have been there for years on end, who can return to our communities, who can come back to their families, who no longer pose a danger to the community, and who are spending millions of dollars simply warehousing in institutions where they don't need to be and where no one's better off. I think we also need to recognize that measures of success for district attorneys in the old days have too often been based on numerics around how many cases did you indict, what's your conviction rate, how many cases did you try, and the sorts of simplistic metrics that really produced a very regressive starting point that I think Alicia and others referenced earlier. So we need to look for new kinds of measures that say, to what extent are prosecutors and DAs embracing a new starting point? To what extent are they embracing a way to promote trust with the community? How does their community feel about how safe they are, and what are metrics that look at the integrity of the system, look at preserving the integrity of convictions, look at reopening past decades-long sentences? How engaged are these leaders in the community? How many exit ramps are they promoting and trying to bring about from the justice system? So I think we need to look at a different paradigm for the role of DAs that recognizes that communities need to be safer and they need to be healthier. And if they don't trust the justice system, nobody's going to be better off. And the job needs to be a fundamentally different one to get there.
Is some of this because the district attorneys and the other prosecutors are so overwhelmed with the number of cases that they just don't have the time to really pay attention like they should?
We hear that, but I think in some ways that's a problem of their own making. If you criminalize everyone who is struggling with drug use or mental illness or poverty or so many other things that we don't need to have our justice system be so large that it's sucking in, if you criminalize those things, of course you're going to be on overload. And I think that we need district attorneys and prosecutors who are willing to make better choices at the front door, who realize that there's just too much that the justice system has tried to own, that if it gets out of the way, mental health, public health, social supports will fill a space that the criminal justice system has tried to fill and done a pretty poor job in aiming to fill it.
Jody, go ahead, yeah.
Just wanted to ask that really quickly. It's definitely a problem of their own making, and what we're seeing with prosecutors around the country is that they're choosing to not do that, right? Head prosecutors that are getting elected are running on platforms where they're talking about the fact that they're not going to prosecute, sex work, for example, or crimes of poverty. And those are the types of things that can reduce caseloads and are really far beyond the purview of a prosecutor's office. And when that happens, it also, talking about how much power they have, it influences law enforcement and what law enforcement is going to go and engage in. And if they know that their district attorney, this is not always true, of course, but I do think it can affect their behaviors. If they know a district attorney is not going to be charging for certain types of crimes, they may stop ticketing for those types of crimes, right? Because they know nothing is going to happen from that. And so it's sort of this cycle that feeds each other. And there are prosecutors that are trying to undo that by just saying they're not blanket, they're not going to charge certain types of offenses in other states outside of California, marijuana possession, other simple drug possession. And then it is producing caseloads and making a difference. And people think, oh, there's the law and they need to enforce the law, but they actually have the power not to.
A stark symbol of the perverted priorities of prosecutors that lead to these kind of distortions is rape kit backlog. If you've ever heard of rape kit backlog, often they're blamed on, oh, we're just overwhelmed, we're under-resourced, we need more resources, and if we had them, we would be able to address these issues. The reason you have rape kit backlog is because they're enforcing turnstile jumping laws. They're going after turnstile jumpers, they're going after pot possessors, they're going after quality of life infractions, they're going after broken windows problems. That's where their resources are going, and they're not taking seriously these rape kits, for example, and they're letting them backlog in the warehousing. They're not taking seriously serious violent homicides. In some black neighborhoods, they have a 35% homicide resolution rate, right? The black community is crying out for more effective enforcement of homicide and violent offenses and rapes, but instead we're going after the low-hanging fruit from the standpoint of prosecution and police.
Yeah. Alicia, I want to ask you about the immigrant community and how is that community impacted by decisions made by the district attorney?
Yeah, so immigration law is one of the things that's constantly changing, and the impact that a criminal conviction can have on you if you don't have status is enormous. And the district attorneys in California, district attorneys have to follow a state law that says that they must take into consideration the immigration consequences when they charge somebody and when they offer them a plea bargain. So if you're plea bargaining and the district attorney said, you let the district attorney know there's immigration consequences here, they're supposed to take that into consideration and instead offer a charge that does not have those immigration consequences. I think that the trouble with that, though, is that as defense attorneys and as people facing those charges, the immigration law constantly changes, and so the charge that you accept today could be a deportable offense the next day. And so it's really a huge problem. And then when people are able to expunge their records, meaning to get the criminal conviction off of their record, that doesn't necessarily provide them immigration relief. And so it's really catching people in this huge cycle. We also see, ICE waiting outside of courtrooms. We see district attorneys alerting ICE to the fact that somebody who doesn't have legal status is at the courthouse, and people waiting for communities at the courthouse, which is, terrifying. And just for one more example, I had a case where a young man was having issues with his family, and they were having domestic violence issues, and his family was calling the police on him, and charges were filed against him. The family did not necessarily realize what they were putting into motion by calling the police on their son, and they didn't want to testify. But the district attorney threatened us with the fact that they would charge his family, who was undocumented with consent, if they didn't come to court and testify against him. And so he chose to take a plea deal, even though his family wasn't going to testify against him, which would have resulted in a dismissal. He took a plea deal so that his family would not have to face the threat of criminal prosecution. And so it's really the opposite often is what's happening from the DA's perspective, is that they're using this information against people to threaten them with criminal prosecution, to call ICE and alert them to come and pick people up. And so there's this huge sort of feeder from the criminal justice system into the immigration carceral system.
Jody's no longer here. So I think Alicia's given some examples of the fact that we're in a moment right now, obviously, where the immigration net, due to the views of some of our federal national leaders, has been cast and is extending wider and wider. And as a result of that, elected prosecutors have a tremendous opportunity to do harm, and they also have an opportunity to do the right thing and to be a positive influence. And we've been trying to impress upon the elected prosecutors that we work with that this is really no different than the way they would engage if local law enforcement is engaged in behavior that's violating people's rights and constitutional rights and harming them in ways that are unacceptable. That DAs, prosecutors, have a role to play to protect everyone in their community from law enforcement overreach. And so more and more what we're seeing among the DAs that we're working with is that they do now have individuals in their offices who are immigration experts, who are attempting to give advice to prosecutors, line prosecutors, about immigration consequences. So they know what the ramifications would be and can take those into account and not charge or look to divert or look to put somebody on a different pathway if they're going to be facing draconian consequences based on that charge. We're working with a DA in Boston who has brought a lawsuit to keep ICE out of her courthouses because she's essentially said that they have no place in that courthouse, that needs to be a safe space where everyone in the community can feel that they can come forward, victims, defendants, witnesses, and not fear that ICE, that federal immigration enforcement, will be there waiting for them. We brought the voice last week of 80 elected prosecutors and law enforcement leaders to a brief in the Supreme Court on behalf of DACA, arguing that if we don't defend DACA, we are doing violence to the integrity of our legal system, and we can't keep communities safe if they don't believe in the integrity of our system. So I think we need to be asking elected prosecutors where they come out on these issues, because they own these issues as much as they own all of the other issues that people often ask them about. And we have to recognize that the body that they can control by virtue of the decisions that they make is a pretty vast one, and they should be held accountable for those decisions.
And Michael, I want to ask you a question. You talked in great detail about your own personal experience. Now that you're with the Youth Justice Coalition, how much of that do you see still happening to other young people. Is it changing? Are things, are there fewer and fewer of those kinds of cases, or that's not the answer?
In my experience, I'm also the legal coordinator for the Youth Justice Coalition, so I help with participatory defense, expungements, and things of that nature. I'm also a self-educated person, autodidactic from learning the law in prisons and litigating for myself. So most recently, we're helping a family member with a 14-year-old son who the cops say that he wrote on a book or a piece of paper his nickname and that they associated with the gang. And so that has tremendous consequences because now he's in the gang database. And as a juvenile, that can lead to so many other things when he tries to get, employment later on, housing. So I think just having that label on you is very, very discriminatory and oppressive.
Ellie, I wanted to ask you about, what do you think, are there any suggestions for how to make, to lessen the impact of these kinds of incidents on families, on parents, and on jobs for people?
In regard to...
In regard to the kinds of cases that Michael was talking about and some of the cases that these folks were talking about where district attorneys are going after people because of one thing or another and it's really not necessarily necessary.
I think that, especially as a person who is undocumented and comes from a mixed status family, it's important to definitely talk about these things. And knowing that, the current political climate that we're in, it's very tolling and taxing and tolling on everything. So I think that being able to have dialogue where we can have the voices of folks that are directly impacted, where we can educate ourselves. Like Michael said, he is self-taught. He learned litigation and litigated his own cases, learned all of that in prison. I think that being able to have these conversations and in the community where we can talk about these different issues is really important. Because I think part of it is also the internalizing all of these different labels and we criminalize ourselves because of the things that we're taught. And I think that part of it also has to do with sorry, I'm blinking out right now. But part of it, I know, part of it also has to do with
how to reduce the impact on families and jobs and that people who get accused of doing things like you were talking about,
I think that one of the things that one of our campaigns of YJC is divesting from law enforcement, because that's how we get pushed out of high schools. We don't have resources at the community level. We are, taught about these different things. And with YJC, that's why it's important that we have the organizing component, but also the high school component where we teach young people about how the system is rigged to oppress Black and brown folks. So part of that campaign, we're pushing to divest from law enforcement and move that money toward community resources so we can have more youth centers, college prep and job training and stuff. And I think that education, is really important in being able to combat that.
Thank you. So, Jody, I wanted to ask you about the death penalty, because people in California have voted for the death penalty. But Governor Newsom says no one will be executed on his watch. I know you've done a lot of research on this. Is there a racial component to the death penalty?
Oh yeah, I have a book coming out next year in which I talk about the empirical evidence for our biased decision making when it comes to moral judgment about wrongdoers. And The mens rea requirement in the law requires us to inquire into a wrongdoer's heart, if you will, their disposition, their level of blameworthiness. And you take two similarly situated people, you have engaged in the same wrongful act, maybe one black and one white, and the subjects consistently judge the black wrongdoer more harshly than a similarly situated white wrongdoer. Black hearts and white minds, but not just in white minds. Chris Ross lets you know that black hearts and black minds can also be judged very harshly. Just the blackness itself, empirically, the empirical research that I've been delving into demonstrates that we have deep biases when it comes to making moral judgments of blacks, and they're therefore more likely to find them death worthy. Not only Jennifer Eberhard up at Stanford got a MacArthur Award for the research she did, in which she found that if you take, not only are blacks more likely to be deemed death worthy than similarly situated whites for the same crime, but the darker you are, the more death worthy you're deemed by the subjects, right? And all of that's happening on an unconscious level with both black and white offenders. So when it comes to the death penalty, the last project I did at USC, the play I wrote about the death penalty had to do with Stanley Tookie Williams, and I asked the question, should we pour liquor for Tookie? Stanley Tookie Williams had just been put to death when Arnold Schwarzenegger denied his petition for a stay of execution. And in front of, we had 1,100 students, and the question was, should we express ritualistic solidarity with a cold-blooded killer? Because as Miriam pointed out, if we're going to make deep cuts in mass incarceration, we're talking about violent wrongdoers. You're not going to make deep cuts by getting rid of low-level, non-violent drug offenders. That's about 5 to 6% of the state population, FAT pointed out, at most. So unless we fundamentally rethink, come to a way to view people who commit violent crimes, not through the lenses of retribution, retaliation, and revenge, as we've been doing for the last 30 years, but rather through the lenses of restoration, reconciliation, and redemption. That fundamental shift in how we think of wrongdoers, recognizing that hurt people hurt people. That, you know, all of us are nothing but a tissue of contingencies when you really get down to it. And that ability, it's kind of a gestalt shift, but it's what's going to be required for the electorate to keep moving the DAs in the right direction. So we, by the end of that play, because we have a lot of artists coming forward and making arguments, and through their art that invited sympathetic identification with people we usually otherize, demonize, and inward-eyes. You had a lot of people standing up with their lighters in the air in solidarity with Stanley Tookie Williams. So it's going to take that kind of fundamental shift in how we think about blame and punishment itself. The recognition that human frailty is there for all of us, there before the grace of God, both any and all of us. We have a hard time doing that sometimes, especially when we're on the receiving end of being of hurt and pain and suffering. But that's the move that we're going to have to make, and we're going to have to start it with the death penalty.
Thank you. I want to remind everybody. Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So, Stanley Williams III, his son was my neighbor in solitary confinement, and I read his book, Black Grade, Blue Grade, Black Redemption. And his son was protesting the fact that they were going to execute his father, and they put his son in solitary confinement, validated him as a prison gang member, which he wasn't, just for protesting and standing up for his father. So I think it's so related, and thank you for sharing that.
So I want to remind you that if there's a question that we haven't gotten into here, and it's something you want to know about, please write it on the card, and we're going to be getting into that in just a few moments. Really appreciate it. Alicia, I want to ask you about the situation where some district attorneys have sort of turned off the spigot in terms of prosecuting marijuana cases, for example, or other lower drug types of cases. Is that something that you see happening here in California?
I don't know for example, or a mental health issue, and they're kind of segmented off in another court that's supposed to, they call them problem-solving courts, but it oftentimes replicates the same sort of cycle of punishment. So if somebody is supposed to be getting drug testing and they miss a test, they can be violated and put in jail for 2 days just for that happening, right? I think what I see is the development of those instead of really developing either policies not to file, and I'm talking mostly about LA County and Orange County, which is what I know the best. So there's not a lot of policies not to file, but there have been some efforts at diversion. So there was a new mental health law that was passed recently where certain crimes are eligible to be never filed against if somebody, has a mental health issue and accesses treatment and completes treatment. And so I think what happens though is when these laws pass that are statewide laws, there's not a lot of trickle down in the training. So the line DAs don't necessarily understand mental health. They don't necessarily understand substance abuse. I've heard people talk about, oh, well, you relapse, so that means you're not amenable to treatment, so we're not going to offer you diversion, which is actually the very definition of recovery, is relapse is part of recovery, but there's not a lot of that training to really understand social issues, and so the DAs sort of get positioned as these experts on what a danger somebody is to the public, without actually really having any kind of training about psychology, about substance abuse, about mental health, about poverty and homelessness. And so I think there's just a whole lot more, and I don't think training is going to solve the problems, but in terms of really complying with diversion programs and taking advantage of some of the things that exist that would take people out of the system, I don't see a lot of that happening at the sort of lower level.
And Virani, what are you seeing in terms of what the more progressive district attorneys are doing with issues like this and other similar issues?
Right. Well, I think that we are in this incredible moment where there is an increasing conversation around where should the criminal justice system be and where should it disengage. And I think Alicia's point is a really good one. If the solution is to simply divert people and impose conditions that are completely unrealistic, then we're setting people up for failure. And we're really not owning the fact that issues like substance use disorder are public health issues. These should not even be coming through the front door of the criminal justice system. And so I do think that there is a growing appetite in various parts of the country to move in that direction. The prosecuting attorney in Seattle has essentially come forward and said that he simply is not going to criminalize anymore what he views as a public health issue, that he will not criminalize possession of any kind of drug, whether marijuana or any other kind of drug, that he believes that if he can get out of the way, that the public health system might step up. And so we're seeing those choices being made in other parts of the country. The state's attorney in Baltimore came forward recently with a pretty pervasive marijuana non-prosecution, non-criminalization policy. And unfortunately, her law enforcement is continuing to arrest, but she has essentially said, I don't care, you can keep arresting, but I'm not going to file these cases because I don't care whether somebody has a small quantity or a large quantity. If it's for personal use, we have better things to do with our limited resources than to start to criminalize largely young black men who are using marijuana. So, I think that there are different choices that are starting to be made around the country. We took a group of prosecutors to Portugal earlier this year to see a model where a nation that had had extensive problems with heroin abuse, with other sorts of drug problems, that completely shifted the paradigm. And now public health has filled the space that the criminal justice system previously filled. So I do think that we're finding places, including in California. One of the DAs that was with us on the trip was from Northern California. And, I think he came back and became a big believer in the need to no longer be criminalizing simple possession of drugs that are a manifestation of a different kind of conduct that doesn't need to be criminalized and that is not effective when criminalized.
Can I add to that really quickly? So I just want to share a little bit about, now that we're on the topic of like drug use and how it's used for the like criminalized, as you just mentioned. But with YJC and the Stop Coalition, we conducted data to, document the use of force incidents in LA County from 2000 to 2017. And we found that in LA County in the 17-year span, there's been at least 854 people that were killed by law enforcement. So even though we are in California, which is, blue states, seen as very like progressive, California and LA County both lead the nation in use of force. With drug use, what we have seen, we have like DA reports of when the use of force incident is justified, and they state that if a person has, for example, cocaine or any other like drug in their system, it's used to justify the use of force. They'll say, oh, the person was killed because they had a heart attack that resulted from the drug use, but they don't state that it was the use of force itself. Sometimes people get, hogtied or with the hubble restraint. And there is, altercation with law enforcement person, and they say that the person died because of the drug use as a result of the drug use, and not of the use of force, from law enforcement. So I just wanted to share that.
Go ahead.
One place where the rubber meets the road here in LA is the question of how do we approach criminal wrongdoing? Do we view it as an expression of a character defect in the people that we're arresting, or is it connected to some other kinds of issues that can't be reduced to that? There's our own homelessness set of problems here in LA, right? We're getting ready for the 2028 Olympics, and we are cracking down on the down and out. That is, if you first saw it in 2006 with the Safer Cities Initiative, where they put 80 more officers in Skid Row, and the whole idea was we see poverty itself as a personal failing, so the way you address poverty is by citing people, handcuffing them, throwing them in cells, and saying, you can get this taken care of, you can do something about this record, but you got to go to one of the mega shelters and get involved in a basically 12-step program equivalent that is going to help repair you as a broken person. You're internally broken. That's the problem. The problem isn't a lack of income, a lack of housing, a lack of adequate health care, a lack of all the external things that we know really are at the tap root of the problem. The problem is your own deficient character. And we're going right back there now with our cracking down approaches, therapeutic policing. The velvet fist and the iron glove is how they try to justify it, but it's really vicious and ugly, and it's otherizing the people who are most in need of support rather than demonization.
Okay, so we're going to take some questions from the audience now. We've got a lot of cards here and some good questions. So Ellie and Michael, the first one is for you. Do you know someone who personally took a plea even though they were innocent? And then the next thing part of it was, why would someone take such a plea?
Me. Not to say that I'm an innocent, angel, perfect person, but I think, many times, and I may have done something wrong, but it was the prosecution who piled on all these added charges that led to higher sentence, and therefore, if you're a young person and you're sitting in the county jail, which is very violent, it's inhumane, and you miss your family, you miss your freedom. You're looking at a trial, because if you don't take the plea bargain and you don't have enough money to bail out, you're stuck there. And who wants to be stuck there? And if the prosecution or your public defender comes to you and tells you, hey, you can go home right now if you just sign this plea bargain, but in effect, not really telling you about the repercussions for the rest of your life. You're in this caste system of disenfranchisement, a felony for life, because some things you can't get expunged, and on the rare exceptions, You know, they may be pardoned by the governor, but again, that's rare, and who's getting pardoned. So, yeah, definitely, I think sitting in a cell for, you know, a few months, anybody will probably take a plea bargain just to get out of jail.
There was a program on Netflix called Unbelievable about a rape case. And this was based on a true story. And the young lady was harassed by the police officers who were investigating the case and questioning her over and over and over again. And finally she just said, I made it up. But the truth is, she didn't make it up. Because another department then went and investigated the case and found out she was raped. So, I mean, she just had enough. She couldn't take it anymore. And I think that's, you know, part of what the police have to deal with. Certainly better than they did in this case. So here's another question. What are your thoughts on abolishing cash bail and replacing it with pretrial risk assessment? Because that's another big issue here. Cash bail.
So we're in a position now where California did abolish cash bail, but the bail bonds industry has now gathered enough signatures to put something on the ballot for November 2020. So please look out for that election where they're hoping to repeal that legislation. But the legislation that was passed in California would require the use in every county of risk assessments to determine whether or not somebody should be released from custody before trial. And there's a lot of controversy around risk assessments, primarily even the ones that are transparent, that you can tell sort of what they're measuring. What they look for generally is how many prior convictions has somebody had, were they violent prior convictions, at what age did somebody have those convictions, how many failures to appear in court, because the judge has to think about, is this person going to come back to court? And what we know about all of those things, every one of us has just been explaining, is that there are certain communities targeted by law enforcement and by the DAs, and those certain communities are going to score at higher risk because of the targeting of those communities, not because they're higher risk, not because they're more dangerous than anybody else. I think the recent articles about the Los Angeles Police Department and the traffic stop really shows that who did they find, they were stopping black men more than anybody else, but it was more frequently that they found contraband on white people. So it's who's getting stopped, who has that on their record. When you have cities and counties that have a history of targeting communities of color, which is virtually everywhere in the country, or targeting poor communities, they're going to ultimately score at a higher risk on these risk assessments. So there are a lot of communities, a lot of work being done here in LA with the pretrial Justice Reform Coalition, Justice LA, and Dignity and Power Now, folks who are really trying to imagine a different way, to stop thinking about people as these labels, to stop thinking about people as risks. Because really what you're doing then is you're saying, well, we don't believe you have any power to transform or change, or that there can't be anything we could possibly put in place that could sort of transform your situation and transform what's going to happen in your life. And so I think there are other ways to do things. You can assess somebody on an individualized basis. The Bail Project is one organization that's opened sites around the country where they're bailing people out. They're paying people's bail for them, and they have an incredibly high success rate, which shows that people don't need the incentive of paying cash to return to court. But the majority of people are going to return to court because they understand they have an obligation to return to court. People are fleeing the jurisdiction and going to, Finland or wherever people go to flee the jurisdiction, right? And so these organizations are showing that if you bail people out, they will come back to court. There does not need to be a risk assessment. There's not a higher risk of reoffense when people are out, and that's the system that we should be working towards. So I'm very strongly against risk assessment.
Add to that, and actually I will point out, I think they're at the back of the room, that there is a set of principles that our organization, in partnership with others, the Justice Collaborative, the Brennan Center, and Emily Bazelon, a journalist whose book Charged, I would encourage folks to read. If you really want to understand both the power and also the ability to do good and the ability to do damage as an elected prosecutor. I think there are a few things better than Emily's book charge, but we tried as a project with Emily and other groups to put together these 21 principles. That is our effort to define what does the North Star look like? What does the blueprint look like for a reform-minded elected prosecutor? And our hope is that this will be not simply a guide for those in office, but also a guide for community and voters around what to ask for, what questions, what issues are important. And so we talk about cash bail as well as the broader context of the poverty penalty. And I think that there are other areas that we have to be equally concerned about, fines and fees and costs of the justice system that are imposed on individuals rather than on all of us as a government system or a community that similarly compound that two-tiered system of justice, where how much you earn and what your financial wherewithal is going to set a trajectory as to whether you're going to end up behind bars and back into the justice system and cycling through the system or on a different pathway. I think the other thing that we need to recognize with cash bail is that it has a cost for society as well. Namely, incarcerating individuals unnecessarily destabilizes them, puts them at greater risk of cycling through future criminal behavior. So it's not simply not removing individuals from the community based on the question of safety or danger alone. It is exacerbating the problem. And we have to realize those costs when we think about whether we want to support a cash bail system and whether we should be embracing in its place a system that has its own set of problems. So it doesn't need to be an either or. We don't need to replace cash bail with risk assessment tools that are simply going to compound the kinds of problems that cash bail and other elements of the justice system will cause.
So I want to put this out to everybody again, and that is that how do you respond when people on the other side of this issue say, crime is down? The LA crime numbers are way down from what they used to be. I mean, that's the argument that the other side puts up. What's the response to that? We don't need to make changes because crime is down. I mean, that's that's their approach.
Yeah, well, you have to get into the numbers and not be afraid to crunch them. And when you crunch them, I remember when they ended, remember a couple years back, there was a lot of nationality around whether they were going to stop the stop and frisk profiling in New York City. The approach, where at one time it was upwards of 600,000 disproportionately black and brown, but especially in the black community, folks who were being stopped and frisked. And when you, I have on my Twitter account, they have another account that just is runs off the number of stops they're making and the age and what they're stopping for. And what you see is 12 years old, 16 years old, 18 years old, 13 years old, and they routinely stop them for furtive movements, whatever a furtive movement is. It's whatever, that's a Rorschach influx test. It tells you a lot more about the observer than the observed, right? And you can fill it with anything. And so people were saying, if we stop this stop and frisk, New York Daily, all of these papers, crime is going to spike, it's going to go through the roof. There were a lot of cataclysmic prognostications about what was going to happen when you stopped it. They stopped it. The judge came in and said it's unconstitutional. And they went from 600,000 down to around 80,000, 70,000 stops, a precipitous drop off. And guess what? Crime kept going down. It didn't go up. And even the New York Daily News came out and said, we were wrong. I didn't expect to hear them even say, all of these people, yeah, we were wrong. This is what Giuliani made his bones as a mayor on. Stop and frisk. We were wrong. So, the numbers often don't support what seems like the so-called common sense. That a lot of times there's a lot of common myths and misconceptions. And when you crunch the numbers, you can really see that. Someone like John Fass is really good at just puncturing a lot of those false kinds of correlations, because correlation isn't causation, by really digging into the numbers.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Add on that, I'm not a statistics expert, and I don't know, I can't speak for all of California, but I can speak for our community and what we're doing at the Youth Justice Coalition. I'm sure a lot of people seen after the death of Nipsey Hussle, the famous picture of Bloods and Crips coming together and uniting and having a peace treaty. And I think what it is folks in the community are becoming woke, right? Like, there's a lot of black and brown peace treaties going on where we're not killing each other because we're realizing that this system is made to put us all in prison and jails, right? And I think another thing that we're learning also that we do at the Chucos Justice Center with YJC is alternatives to 911. And the fact that a lot of people in the communities no longer trust the police because of all these police shootings. And I think there's a correlation there with people seeing every day on the news brown and black people getting killed, unarmed people getting killed, that they're no longer, they're afraid of the police in the community. They're afraid to call because they might have one of their loved ones sent to deported or sent to jail for just a domestic dispute. And anytime the police get involved, somebody's going to jail. So I think that's it.
Most recently in Fort Worth. Yeah. The lady was killed, she wasn't doing anything, and they're charging the officer with murder now. So how can we have a system that allows pretrial detention and reconcile that with the core issue of presumption of innocence? Anybody? Going once? Twice?
I'll just say quickly, how do you reconcile it? You're presumed innocent, but we're going to make your freedom turn on whether you have enough in your bank account to buy your way out of jail. If you have enough, well, forget all the risk assessment tools. I can get the bond, right? So it seems to fly in the face of the, vaunted presumption of innocence and the first day of criminal law. I tell the students, the bedrock of the criminal justice system, the Supreme Court says it, is a cornerstone of it, is the presumption of innocence. The burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt implements the presumption of innocence, and then we make a mockery of it when we actually go through the process.
So here we go. In the long term, do you think it's better to restrict the district attorney's power? Why not? Should they be restricted somewhat? I mean, we're saying here that they're the ones that are making the rules and they're responsible for how the system is working, right?
I mean, personally, I'm an abolitionist. I'm also an organizer for critical resistance. I believe prisons, police, law enforcement are not the solutions, they're not the answer. It's community. We don't need police, the government, to tell us how to deal with our people, how to help and cure our people. We need more resources put into these communities to help it at the root of the problem. If you heal from the root of the problem, you won't have a need for this criminal justice system.
Just to also piggyback off of that and put into perspective, the way that I see reform is if you're just putting like a band-aid on the system. It doesn't get at the root of the problem. That's why I mentioned earlier that to me reform is okay as long as it's on a path toward abolition. Because if we just keep putting band-aids to stop the leak, that's not going to do anything. The pipes are going to burst. So even if we, replace the DA with another that's more progressive, it's still not going to do enough because we're still stuck in that same system and it's not addressing the root of the problem.
Okay, next. How can we combat the Willie Horton problem? That is, many DAs may express fear that if they agree to pretrial release or no incarceration and a new crime is committed, they will be blamed. Given the lack of reentry resources and fixing of societal problems, new crimes will occur. What do you think?
Well, so I'll take that on because it's something that we talk about quite a bit with a lot of the newer elected DAs that we work with. I think we have to recognize that those cases are kind of like the flu. They're going to hit eventually. And we can't live our lives in fear of that. If you're so scared of getting the flu, then you live in a bubble and you never do anything else. So I think the analog for leaders who are willing as prosecutors, as DAs, to lead, is if you're going to live in fear of the Willie Horton case, then don't run for office and don't take the job on. Because then you're going to be making every decision in the quote-unquote safe way, which is simply doing more damage to individuals, to communities, to families, by over-incarcerating, by continuing the generational cycles that we've already put in place. I think the second thing we have to realize is that we just need, as we talked about earlier, new measures of what is success and what is this job about. It's not about avoiding that one case in 100 that goes wrong. It's about trying to bring about the 99 cases in 100 that go right. It's trying to keep those 99 families on a different pathway and a better pathway. So we have to be willing to own, to lift up, and to try to get the media as well to cover those 99 success cases and not simply focus on the one that goes wrong. And I think the final thing that we need to be thinking about is how do we avoid playing to a fear rhetoric, especially in what's going on at a national level with leaders who are trying to drive policy around causing people to live in fear of each other. And I think we all have a responsibility to fight back on that fear rhetoric that is seeking to divide us rather than bring us together. If it's simply about making communities safe, again, we can over-police our way to safety. We can tell people to never leave their homes and presume that they're somehow safe. But I think we need to be willing to lift up and own a dialogue that looks at a criminal justice system that's trying to bring about healthier communities, stronger communities, communities that trust in government and law enforcement, and communities that aren't divided and pitting people against each other.
So how do you get around I think the reality that the one that goes wrong is the one that gets the attention? That's what the television news talks about, right?
I think that's right, and I think that those are the cases where DAs need to be willing to stand up and say, you know, that happens, and it's tragic when it does, and we regret when it does, but let's look at the 99 other cases where it didn't happen. And let's not drive our policy by that one case, because we have other success stories that shouldn't cause us to base policy on the one Willie Horton as opposed to the hundreds of others who don't play out that way. And I think we all have a responsibility to stand behind those leaders and to try to lift them up and not overreact as voters and as members of the community when those cases do occur, and not look for heads to roll when those cases do occur, but instead recognize that that is the sign of communities that are safer and healthier and more trusting of each other.
You know, you hit the nail on the head. We have a lot of these laws based on outlier cases, like Jessica's law, Megan's law. Many of our laws involve somebody who's innocent and vulnerable, who's been seriously injured, and they become the name of a new law. You know, they become the justification for 3 strikes, right? There was a bad case that happened just before the vote on the 3 strikes, and that drove a lot of support for it. And so that's a serious rhetorical issue, right? If you're going to get in this fight, you got to be ready to take that on. How we're going to deal with those outliers. When I teach torts, I ask which is accident law, all we think about is risk in a tort course, right? I ask my students about, a third of the way through the semester, imagine I was an evil deity and I approached you and I said, I want to give you some boon. It can be some gift. It can make life for the people in your community much more gratifying in some way. All I ask in return is that I can take 1,000 of your young people and subject them to horrible, excruciating deaths. Do you take the gift? And everyone looks at me like I made an indecent proposal, or hardly anyone says I take the gift, right? And then I ask them, I can spend the rest of the class hour trying to distinguish that gift from the automobile, which when I started teaching was taking 55,000 lives a year. It's down to around 40,000 lives a year now. And often that gift of the automobile is for nothing more than the convenience of getting to grandma's house a little sooner. on a given day. That's why we have a speed limit of 65 rather than 55. We could save 40,000 lives overnight if we just put governors on a car engine so that no car could go over 20 miles an hour. But we're not willing to do that. We're willing to spend those lives for the convenience, just the convenience that comes from automobiles. We spend lives every day for sometimes lofty values like freedom of speech, like the right to own a gun, or like a lot of constitutional rights, right? We spend lives for mundane interests and sometimes very lofty interests routinely. It's not whether we're going to spend lives, it's just how many lives for what kinds of values, and what kinds of values we're willing to spend lives for defines us, constitutes us as a community, right? And that kind of thought process, reframing and recalibrating our thinking, you know, that kind of gestalt shift is what it's going to take to really combat that very powerful kind of Megan Law, Jessica Law, because it is that Willie Ford and outlier case problem.
Well, I think we're warming up here now, and so I've got one more question, and I think it'll kind of hopefully bring everything home. And that is, can you talk about some of the specific areas of the criminal justice system in Los Angeles that you would like to see change? Anybody? No? It's perfect? Perfect system? Everything's good?
Again, I would say going back to the criminalization of people of color that they consider to be gang members and the gang enhancement laws, which stem from the Step Back, the war on drugs, and it's kind of like the Willie Horton case, because if you can't villainize or criminalize anybody else, who are you going to criminalize, right? You have to have a villain, and I think they do that with gang enhancements and gang injunctions, gang database. I mean, these are just kids. A lot of them are kids that grow up in these communities with nothing else. And if you're not going to give them nothing else, you can't expect them to be, you know, perfect angels, right? So I think that's something that needs to change. Instead of criminalizing, put money into youth, you know, like YJC and other youth groups and organizations and programs.
Too, you know, there are options that work. So, for example, if you are going to release someone who has been identified as potentially at risk of committing another crime, you can put things in place like services. You can kind of back up and think about, where are we releasing people back into? Is it in the same community where they're being over-policed, don't have a job, you know, have difficulty accessing education? These are the things that we sort of need to look at from a broader lens, so it can't be solved by a district attorney, right? There's serious inequities in our community that cause these things to happen, and so I really would love to see sort of what Ellie was talking about, the reliance on ourselves and our communities and our deep knowledge that we have it within us to resolve conflict and harm, and that we can do this outside of this apparatus that really doesn't care about individuals, that's sort of this machine that's churning people in and out. So there are programs that exist in LA County that are trying to do that are trying to make inroads to say, let's not file charges against somebody, let's talk with them and have them talk with a person that they've harmed, and collectively come up with a solution to hold everyone accountable, to encourage healing, to promote you know, transformation for everybody who has been harmed, including the person who caused harm, because hurt people, and healed people heal people. And so we need to really invest in programs that actually work, and they would work here in LA County. The California Council for Equality and Justice, the Youth Justice Coalition are doing these programs. They've worked in San Francisco. We need to move outside of the system and really focus on healing and true accountability.
So let me maybe surface one area that hasn't surprisingly come up yet tonight. And I think in terms of areas where there's room for improvement, you could almost take any one of these 21 principles and see room for improvement. Before doing the work with Fair and Just Prosecution, I spent 5 years working on law enforcement reform, including around close to 3 years as the executive director of the Citizens Commission for Jail Violence, working on an investigation some of the really horrible things that were going on in terms of how individuals were being treated in our county jails, and real troubling concerns within our sheriff's department. And I think some things got better, but I think there's a lot that is now very much back where we were at the time that commission was formed. And sadly, I just don't feel that our district attorney's office has done what it needs to be doing to crack down on really concerning aspects of what's going on in law enforcement and in that sheriff's department in particular. It doesn't have to be that way. And the fact that we have had decades of a department that has seen the sorts of things that are occurring over and over and over again, deputies who are part of subcultures that have loyalty to each other and not the community, and not their department, and not the oath that they swore. Individuals who are living by a code of silence where it's more about having each other's back than doing right by the community. I don't believe that people go into law enforcement to harm their community, but I think unfortunately cultures can change that. And so I really feel that we're at a moment in time that is very precarious for our sheriff's department. And where nationally the accountability for law enforcement is enabling individuals who do wrong in one department, like whack-a-mole, to surface in another department. And so we have a responsibility as a large urban area, even without this problem in our backyard, to be doing more. But given what's going on in our backyard, I think this is an area where the next district attorney, whomever he or she may be, has so much potential in terms of what they can do and what they need to be doing.
So this may be a little far afield, because it doesn't directly necessarily impact the district attorney. But what about making access or making treatment more accessible for mental illness or drug addiction, so that people who want to stop using drugs, they need help with mental illness. You know, our society has kind of said, hey, it's everybody for themselves.
I think a lot of drug abuse stems from, economic problems and a lot of problems in the community that aren't being addressed, and it's more of like self-medicating. If you don't have a job, you lose your job. What do people do? They start drinking or doing drugs. You step outside, there's a liquor store in the hood on almost every corner, right? There's marijuana shops all over. So I think that it's folks just trying to deal with the trauma and the stuff that they are going through, and we have to find a way. I think again, it goes back to investing in the communities. If you give people jobs, you give people opportunities, they don't need to do all that, right? I mean, I can speak for myself. I spent 19 and a half years in prison, 15 of that in solitary confinement. That didn't change me. It only made me a more criminalized person when I was ready to come out and go back to that same lifestyle. But I got connected with folks. I got a job at YJC. I got involved in community college, and that just changed my whole outlook. And I don't ever want to go back. I just want to go higher and higher and educate myself more and more.
I think that it's also important to look at like the historical context, because with law enforcement specifically, like looking at settler colonialism and all of this, and like I think that we need to start, especially as communities of color, we need to start pushing against like that deficit perspective where we blame ourselves, where we're blaming people for their actions. What led to people, causing harm or relying on substance abuse is the conditions that we are put in, and the current society that we are in. It's a deficit system where we blame the person, we blame the student for dropping out, and it takes away the blame from the system. It puts the blame on the person, saying it's your fault, you did this wrong, it's your fault that you're not in school, it's your fault that you're addicted, whatever. And I think that taking a step back and looking at the historical context is really important, and just looking at how these different systems are connected. Like Michael mentioned, we have no grocery stores, we have liquor stores. You know, we have all these different things that, you know, are connected and that leads people to, you know, to the places where they are right now.
Good, I think we're done. Hey, thank you all, thank you all.